Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to St. Anselm College. We're so delighted to have you. My name is Alyssa Margolin. I direct the Initiative for Housing Policy and Practice here at the college. The initiative was launched just in January of 2025, and you might think that that sounds very recent, but really we are a result of a lot of work that was done with the Center for Ethics and Society related to housing with many of the partners that are here today. And so I just want to take this opportunity to thank you for being here at the launch of one of our new programs, the Housing and the Economy Speaker Series. Thank you for being here. I also want to thank Tanner, our sound and lighting tech today, who found me this stepping stool. In many events where I've spoken here, I've been hiding behind the podium, and it reminds me of when I was a staffer for Congressman John Olver in the 1st Congressional District, who has since passed away, and I would run events for him. And that was during the Clinton administration, and Secretary Reich was a good friend of his and a frequent speaker. And there was not a step stool that you could provide the secretary that would accommodate his needs, so he used to carry his own. He had a staff person dedicated to that. But we are in for a treat. Matthew Yglesias has a top-ranked Substack that I read every day. I admit I am a little addicted to his perspective and his writing. He started talking about housing before anybody did. These kind of moments for someone to come here and help us all think differently, advance the conversation, maybe spark a little debate and conversation is made possible with sponsorships. And this whole speaker series is really supported by a bequest here at the college, the Sidney Samuels Fund. And I tried to find out a little bit about Mr. Samuels, who he was, and there wasn't much more than the bequest letter. But for me, it made me think about, actions that we take that have that ripple effect. This is kind of relative to what we're trying to do with housing, to take on just an incredibly acute problem and do everything we can to have a positive ripple effect. And so I am grateful that Mr. Samuels decided to dedicate a fund to the college so we can bring in speakers like Matthew Yglesias. We also have other sponsors, the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, New Hampshire Realtors, New Hampshire Housing, Merrimack County Savings Bank, Housing Action New Hampshire, Evernorth, Mascoma Bank, Anagnos Companies, Portsmouth Housing, and Keene Housing. I'm going to turn the podium, I'm going to move the step stool, Xavier, to the Initiative for Housing Policy and Practice, first undergraduate housing fellow, Xavier Deshane.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Xavier Deshane. I am a sophomore here at St. Anselm College, studying politics and philosophy. As a fellow with the Initiative for Housing Policy and Practice, I have developed a strong interest in housing issues. That is why I'm looking forward to hearing from today's speaker, Matthew Yglesias. Matthew is a journalist, author, and co-founder of Vox with Ezra Klein. He now writes one of the top-ranked Substacks, The Slow Boring on Politics and Economics. His book, The Rent is Too Damn High, What to Do About It, and Why It Matters More Than You Think, as well as his subsequent writings, has greatly influenced the conversations around the causes and solutions of the housing crisis. A fun fact about Matthew is he spent a lot of his last summer writing from my home state in northern Maine. Please welcome Matthew Yglesias to the stage.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks everybody for having me here. This is not at all on the topic of housing, but I mean, I've been thinking all morning about the apparent murder of Charlie Kirk, who's, in my line of work and the discourse and things that people say around that, and I don't have a lot to say about it that's original, but it made me reflect on something that I have really enjoyed about working on the housing issue over the past 5 to 10 years is that this is an issue where we have seen a lot of bipartisanship and a lot of, bipartisanship on both sides of the issue, but just a topic that is important to a lot of people, that has a lot of different kinds of stakeholders and has had different kinds of collaboration that are just not the same as the main grooves of partisan politics and polarization. And it's very sustaining to me to work on a political issue where you find unexpected friends and sometimes unexpected enemies, and just remind yourself of the richness and complexity of the world. So with that being said, it's good to be here in Manchester. I have been here once before. It was about 25 years ago. I was knocking on doors for Al Gore in his primary campaign against Bill Bradley. It's really cold in January in New Hampshire. I don't know if you guys have noticed. People also get sick and tired of the primary campaign, so I got bitten by a dog, and Gore lost. So far, my second visit is going a lot better. So I haven't been to Manchester much, but I have spent a lot of time in New England. I was in college in Massachusetts. My family owns a place in Maine where I've spent a lot of time. Been to Connecticut. I think I went to Vermont once. Doesn't count. But the rest of New England is great. And it's a great region of the country. I mean, it was founded by the people who I think really carry the spirit of the American idea with them more strongly than anybody else. Most of our earliest centers of higher education are here, and this continues to be the part of the country that really exemplifies educational excellence, not just at the most exclusive levels, but this is where mass public education was invented, and it's where we have the most educated workforce in America, is in this region of the United States. And a lot of good stuff follows from that. I mean, this is the highest wage region in the United States. You have a lot of the best public health outcomes are here in New England. And with so much going for it, I mean, you would think that New England would be booming. Right? It has the characteristics that people want in a place to live, right? It's low crime by American standards, it's high-paying jobs are here, but it's not. Over the past generation, this has been one of America's slowest growing regions, not fastest growing, and the question is why? And part of the story is the weather. It's lovely at certain times of year here, but it's long winters, some very dark days. It's not California, it's not Arizona, it's not Florida, and all across the northern United States, you have headwinds ever since air conditioning was invented. But that doesn't explain everything. When I've been to Illinois, I've been to Chicago, other Midwestern cities, the elected officials there are struggling with really sort of deep, profound problems. There is a lack of desire to live in the sort of cold weather interior parts of the country. And you see that not just in a lack of population growth outside of Minneapolis and Columbus, but you see it in quite low prices for homes because there's simply a lack of demand. And so people there, it's complex, very deep, very challenging problems. I wish them luck, and I don't always know the solution. But New England is not like that. We do have some sort of declining industrial towns in New England that remain quite cheap, but broadly speaking, very serious affordability challenges, anywhere near the coastline, anywhere there's a college, any major population center, just incredibly expensive, high cost of living region of the country. And it's a real tragedy. In the modern economy, the vast majority of people work providing what the economists call non-tradable services, stuff that's done face-to-face, in-person basis, can't be outsourced to China or Mexico. So that's your dentists, it's nurses, it's teachers, chefs, hairstylists, plumbers, baristas, interior designers, yoga instructors, all kinds of work is being done. It can be done anywhere, but in practice, the best place to do these jobs should be in the places that have the high-value traded sectors, where you have people working in software, in finance, in higher education, other things like that really bring large sums of money in. Biotech is very important here. In principle, you're better off as a plumber in the Bay Area or in Greater Boston or here in Manchester than you would be in San Antonio or in Jacksonville because you have access to a more affluent base of clients. And that's how sort of prosperity should feed on itself, right? That you have great companies that are selling stuff globally, people are making a lot of money there, but then other people are making money selling services to those people. And like we all win, we all gain. But the problem, researchers have shown is that it's also more expensive to live in those high-wage cities that we have around here. So even though, if you're a working-class service worker, you earn higher wages here in New England or in California than you do in the Sun Belt, but you also pay more in housing costs. And it doesn't add up. So people actually come out ahead moving away from here to lower cost of living states, even though their own earnings go down when they do that. So that's not good. You have a situation where the people who do stay have declining standards of living or ever longer commutes. You also have a situation where, people can't raise their kids near their parents, aunts and uncles and cousins. You can't have the kind of sustaining communities that we want to have. It means that the whole productivity of the United States is lower than it should be because instead of people migrating to the highest productivity, highest wage metro areas, they're migrating to the cheapest ones. And it's not really a left versus right issue, would be my analysis of it. It's why it can be fun, why we can have good bipartisan coalitions, but also it's sometimes hard for people to even understand in a day where everything is very polarized. What we're really having is an issue of localism versus centralization, I think is really on a structural level driving housing scarcity. I live in Washington, D.C. I live on a great block. And what's great about it is that it's right near a very bustling sort of restaurant nightlife corridor, but I'm not on the corridor, right? So I can get there easily, but I don't have the noise. And my street only runs for 1 block. So it's not really a good way to get from anywhere to any place else. So we don't have a lot of traffic noise. And what's really important is I used to live just 1 block away on a through street. And, it was great. It was fun. I liked it. But we'd get the partiers going home, being loud, being rowdy, wake me up at 2 a.m., and I'm too old for that now. So it's great. I got this great quiet street. But recently, an apartment building came in across the street from me. And they were sort of repurposing a building that had a historic facade. So to get permission to build the apartment, they had to go to the Historic Preservation Review Board. And the way the Historic Preservation Review Board's rules work is that they needed to get a letter of support from the local sort of community board organization. So people went, because I believe in housing, I told them, I was like, let's do it. Let's give them the thumbs up. But my neighbors were saying, no, we should make the building be smaller. And I'd say, why? And they'd say, well, it's going to be less traffic, less noise if they make the building smaller. I tried to tell them, no, we need to support the larger building. It's going to be more jobs. It's going to be more affordability for people throughout the city. It's going to be a better tax base. It's going to be more customers for our businesses. All this good stuff that we believe in will be better if we let them build the bigger apartment. But my neighbors were like, traffic, I don't want it. And so the building got built, but it was scaled down. So as a result, fewer people live in the city than really ought to. There's fewer customers for the area businesses. There's fewer job opportunities. There's less revenue for city government. Our services are a little bit worse, and our taxes are a little bit higher than they would be if we had the bigger building. And that's really bad. It's not just bad for people who are struggling with the rent, it's bad for the whole city that we were not able to have a market clearing amount of housing built. But that's the problem. The benefits of housing abundance would go to the whole city, right? Or they go to a whole region, depending on what the sort of structure of your geography is. But the harms of a larger building were very specifically concentrated on my street. And what they were asking wasn't, do we want housing throughout the city? They were asking, what do you think? What do you who live on this block think about this one building that is on your block? And that's the fundamental fact of housing politics. Whether it makes sense for you as a self-interested, normie person to want more or less housing to be built depends really importantly on the scale of analysis. And so that scale question is much more fundamental than ideological questions of left and right, or even some of the like galaxy brain, YIMBY versus NIMBY stuff that we argue about on the internet. I'm very ideologically committed to the sort of pro-housing YIMBY politics. It's the core of my work. You know, on Slow Boring, I cover pro-housing legislation. I try to build up the pro-housing politicians all the time. It's something I incredibly believe in. But it's just still true that no matter how much I believe in this in principle, my life would have been worse if that building was bigger, and it would have been better if it was smaller. And most people are not that ideological, I think, in their day-to-day political commitments. What they want is they want the government to work for them, to serve their interests. And so if you ask, you know, do you want more housing right on your street, right where you live, the normal answer is no. But if you ask the question, do you want more housing throughout the state, throughout the region, throughout the country, the normal answer is yes. And what we have in the United States is a very strong tradition of local control over land use. It's not, you know, in the Constitution, but it's how we do things. So the question about regional housing isn't really one that our political system is used to asking. Instead, we ask the question on a very local basis. And when you ask very locally, the answer tends to be no. So if you look nationally, right, all across America, where does housing get built? A majority of new housing is built in unincorporated areas, right? So big swaths of the country, large amounts of land, they're not part of any formal town, city, village government. There's local government provided by counties, but the counties are often really big in the South and the West, and, you know, they have small numbers of county commissioners, so everybody's representing a really large geographical area. And you ask these county commissions, should we allow a housing development here in the unincorporated land? And they tend to say yes, because they're looking at the interests of a larger geographical unit. They're saying, you know, this is going to help support our infrastructure for our county. It's good. I give it the thumbs up. That's unincorporated areas. You go to New England, of course, you don't have any unincorporated areas in New England. The towns fill the map, except in the part of Maine where literally nobody lives. It's timber, you know, and it's true, right? I mean, if a timber company wants to build housing in the middle of nowhere where there's no roads, they could probably do it, but it doesn't work. And so you are always asking a town government in New England for permission, and they tend to be really small towns because this is an old part of the country. These towns were founded before there were automobiles, so you needed things to be small because people were getting to church, they were getting to town meeting, you know, on foot or on horses. So you got really, really little towns filling all of the land. So, you know, most homes are built on unincorporated land. In New England, you don't have unincorporated land. You have a tradition of weak county government. And so there's no easy place for new construction to happen. And that's why you end up being the most housing constrained region in the country. But you see the same dynamic play out in other regions, sort of informal mechanisms. You know, there's big cities in America, quite a few of them, and they should have a kind of a less localized politics, right? So like, but you get things like neighborhood review in the case of Washington, D.C., and you also get a kind of, you know, we've built into the historic preservation law this kind of hyper-localism that doesn't really make sense. I mean, if you ask, like, what's the point of historic preservation, right? It's, well, there's an aesthetic value to these old buildings. We're trying to preserve them. Whether that's true or not has really nothing to do with, like, the opinion of the guy who happens to live across the street, right? It could, in theory, be a technical analysis. You could have, you know, architects just decide. You could have some kind of cost-benefit analysis. But instead what they have is this sort of informal ask the neighbors policy. And that winds up generating some very odd outcomes. So like one of our historic preservation parcels in Washington, D.C. is a strip mall that is next to a metro station. And, you know, a strip mall is not next to a metro station, seems like prime target for redevelopment. Now, it's true, factually, this is a very old strip mall, so it's historic in that sense, but like nobody has really gone through it and been like, tourists are not coming to visit the old strip mall. It's just, it looks like a parking lot because that's what it is. But, the neighbors there are able to use this as a kind of a hook because they've built localism into the process. And so that's what predominates. And you see this same fight, localism, centralization, playing out in New York City just this week. I've been following this story very closely. There's a tradition in New York that the whole city council will just defer to the judgment of whichever council member a given project is in when they're making a land use decision. So even though the city's really big, there's I think 56 people on the city council, so each council district is pretty small, and so you're in fact doing hyper-local land use politics. So that's a formula for putting a lot of weight on localized traffic impacts and for neglecting sort of citywide economic interest. So New York City's housing advocates put a ballot measure together that they are hoping to pass in November that will sort of take this power away from the council and concentrate it in the mayor's office. Council doesn't like to lose power, so they hatched this kind of plan to get the Board of Elections to not allow people to vote on this ballot measure. The good news was that stakeholders from across the ideological spectrum, Eric Adams, who's the incumbent mayor, but Zohran Mamdani, who's running against him, socialist, they both said, no, council, this is bad. Let people vote on it. The governor also came. She weighed in very strong, we got to let people vote on this. And so it's gone ahead, right? And there's going to be a vote on this. I hope that it will pass. I hope that this housing authority will be concentrated in the mayor's office. And that should naturally lead, without radically altering what people care about or who lives there, it's going to lead to different outcomes because mayors take a bigger perspective and care more about things like growth. Now, my experience is that proponents of localism will often sort of characterize themselves as defending democracy. Right? They'll say, well, we're standing for democracy here. And that's a real tradition in America, right? In American political thought. This country was originally 13 colonies. Each colony had sort of broad local self-government power, but we were subject to the parliament in London. And, they would do things, and we didn't always like the things that they were doing. There was a lot of arguments about this, a war, and we created a whole new country that really was founded in part on the idea that these decisions needed to be made closer to home. And in the rhetoric of the founding generation, there's a lot of sort of muddying the waters between self-government, democracy, republicanism, localism. It all kind of merges together. But I think that we ought to challenge the association between democracy and localism on a few different levels. One reason for that is just that the actual participants in these localized community consultation processes tend to be very unrepresentative of the actual residents. There's a great book called Neighborhood Defenders that looks at this very systematically, and they show there what I think we know from common sense, which is that you get a sample of people that's older, it's wealthier, and it's also really just it's crankier than the average people. When I wanted to put solar panels on my roof, I had to go to a neighborhood meeting and get approval for it. And in the end, it was totally fine. None of the people there had any objections, but I got to see who is showing up to this meeting on a weeknight. It's very few people with kids are coming because, it's time away from your kids, it's a burden on your spouse, it's a little bit irresponsible. Very few just young renter type people are showing up to this sort of meeting, in part because maybe young people have better things to do with their lives, or they're not as, invested in the community. You got a bunch of old folks showing up and they're, the local cop comes and gives a presentation and they ask him questions, and then different people come and sort of beg for permission to build houses in different ways. My thing got approved. It just, it added time, it added cost, but it did get done. But lots of other things, they were like, oh, could you make it smaller? Could you make it smaller? And they normally did. And is that democracy at all? I'm not so sure. But beyond that, It's just not true that more localized decisions are necessarily more democratic. The world has changed from the late 18th century. Most people in America have a lot more knowledge of and information about and feelings about the governor of their state than they do about people on their town council, right? Because we're not learning about politicians through face-to-face meetings. Not everything has to be accessible on horseback. To the extent that anyone knows anything about politics, it's through mass media. And the mass media tends to cover the heads of larger units. Like everybody who pays attention to politics at all knows who Gavin Newsom is, even if they don't live in California, because he's like famous. You ask people, who their state senator is, almost nobody knows. I mean, maybe in New Hampshire you do know, because it's like probably your neighbor. But in general in the United States, people do not know a lot about local government. And there's something undemocratic, actually, about shifting things to these low accountability, sort of obscure offices. But beyond that, the question, why is democracy important, right? One of the main reasons why democracy is important is because people deserve to have their interests taken seriously by the government when these decisions are being made, right? Democracy is a process through which, we get direct input, but also the policymakers, they need to think about us, right? Or else they're at risk of losing office. And so the whole ballgame with housing really is thinking about what is the range of interests that we are considering when we are making these land use regulation decisions. Localism leads to housing scarcity, not because people want housing scarcity, right? These days, Xavier quoted my book on housing that came out in 2011, and I said the subtitle was why this matters more than you think. And that's because in 2011, people didn't really think housing affordability was important. But today, everybody thinks it's important, right? And nobody wants a situation where, when I remember when Amazon was thinking of building a new headquarters someplace, and a lot of people were saying, oh no, I don't want it here. It's just going to raise rent and push people out. That's very dysfunctional. People know that that's bad. People don't want their state budgets to be crushed by legacy pension costs and other things like that. People don't want to see schools closing across their state because there's no young people. People want their kids to be able to get homes for themselves, to raise families. That's all normal stuff. The problem is that the solution that everyone sort of wants in their heart, right, is we'll build lots of housing, but just not that close to my house. That doesn't work, right? I mean, it's fine to feel that way. We're all allowed to be a little bit selfish in our lives. But the new stuff, it has to be somewhere, right? We can't all just veto it. What we can do is we can choose to say yes to more housing everywhere, or we can choose to say no to more housing everywhere. And when you decide that all these decisions have to be made locally, what you're in effect choosing is the universal no. And you can see from the relatively growth-friendly attitudes from county governments that have unincorporated land is that when you ask people the other question, the answer tends to be yes. And that's the big change that's been sort of sweeping the housing landscape over the past 5 years. Advocates have started taking these questions out of the town meetings and the city halls and into the state legislatures. So New Hampshire, earlier this year, the governor signed a really pretty great package of housing reforms. There's going to be more single staircase buildings. Towns are going to have less ability to put parking mandates on people. There's going to be more ADU options. There's going to be more homes in commercial districts. There's supposed to be a new system for housing appeals that I was hearing is maybe not going quite as well as people had hoped, but it's a great idea, right? And these are ideas that come from taking the question to the state government, because you get a different answer there, even though it's still New Hampshire, right? It's the exact same people in the town meeting and the state legislature, or they're being represented, but you get a different answer. And we're seeing moves happening like this on a bipartisan basis in lots of places. Maine, Texas, Florida, Washington have all had really big housing reform packages in 2025 so far. And there's a really big bill pending in the California state legislature that I think will probably pass, maybe not. And so these kind of state level reforms, they're really great news for the American economy. They're really good for affordability. They create, the kind of blue collar construction jobs that a lot of people value. They're good for family formation. They're good for equality. They're good for social mobility. They're good for productivity and long-term economic growth. And I also think that this centralization of decision-making is something that we should encourage because it's fundamentally good for democracy. It means that we are recognizing that housing in the modern world is an issue of a pretty broad significance and that we have not been taking enough people's interests into account when we've been making these decisions. We're living in a world of regional economies. People have cars. They can travel beyond the boundaries of these like rinky-dink town lines, and it's a world of regional economies, and we need our political institutions to keep up with that reality. So if a whole state wants to choose collectively and with deliberation to say, we don't want development here. We don't want development there. We do want it there. We want to have planning. We value certain areas, the heritage of certain places. I think that that's fine because I think that very few states, if they are asked to choose collectively, are going to choose large-scale housing scarcity. They're going to find that there's trade-offs, that there's disagreements, that there's room for reasonable people to disagree about what you should do. But the vast majority of people are going to say we need to find ways to let people build more homes. We want to have a growing economy in our state. You very, very rarely see any kind of elected official who's like, I'm thrilled with just nobody moving here and total stagnation. But you have to force that question onto the agenda to get to the better answer. What's holding us back right now is that a very large number of politicians still believe that the idea of democracy means you have to prioritize localism, and when you prioritize localism, you don't get good housing outcomes. And if you think that housing is important, you have to sort of take this challenge seriously, take it head on, and I think, meet the arguments for localism squarely and really try to convince people that moving to a more centralized decision-making framework is going to get us better outcomes and fundamentally is going to be a more democratic outcome. So that's what I got. Looking forward to a panel.
Thank you, Matthew. So now we are going to move to the second part of our program, which is going to be a panel discussion with Matthew and three special guests, whom I'll introduce in a moment. But I just want to make you aware that at the end of our panel discussion, which will be about 20, 25 minutes, we'll have an opportunity for questions and comments from the audience. So if you have anything, just make a note of it, and we'll have some handheld mics going around, and we'll be sure to get your questions and comments for either Matthew or any of the panelists. Okay, so as I mentioned, we have three panelists who are going to help us sort of digest what Matthew just shared with us. And I'll start with Representative Al Howland, who represents the Stafford County District 20 at the New Hampshire State House. That's a district that includes the town of Durham. And he has notably a seat on the Housing Committee in the State House, which is wonderful. In addition, he has a stellar history of leadership at the local level, as evidenced by his work on the Durham Town Council, the Durham Economic Development Committee, and the Durham Housing Task Force. So he has both the local and the state level that Matthew referenced. So if I can invite Representative Howland to the stage. And just, if I could ask you both to test your lav mics, are they working, or do you need to turn them on?
Does that work?
No. So maybe you
turned
can
them
figure
on.
that out while I'm introducing the others. Okay.
Is that working?
Yes, good, wonderful. Okay, then our next guest is probably not someone that you need to be introduced to. Her name is Maggie Randolph. She's somewhat of a celebrity here in New Hampshire because of her successful work in building housing, cottage community, if you recall, in Dover, New Hampshire, which I found out is in fact completed, so congratulations. What you might not know about her is all of the work that she and her husband, John, successfully accomplished locally to partner with the town of Dover to get land use approval for the project. Maggie is the owner of GSD Studios, an architecture and planning firm with a focus on community, sustainability, and the concept of a home. So welcome, Maggie. And our third panelist, Drew Klein, is the president of the Josiah Bartlett Center for Public Policy in Concord, a native New Hampshire think tank devoted to free markets and limited government. Drew has been a strong voice in support of increasing the supply of housing in the state to help our families, our businesses, and communities, primarily by eliminating restrictive land use regulations. Drew is also an accomplished journalist and currently serves as the chairman of the New Hampshire State Board of Education. So welcome, Drew. Okay, so I'm going to come sit next to them and we'll get started.
We're going to do a test. Ooh, it works. Your turn.
Hello, hello.
Hello. Okay, great. So I'd like to just start by getting some reactions from our panelists to Matthew Yglesias' remarks. Just to refresh our memory, he wants to make the case that localism can often be, or is perhaps even structurally anti-democratic in some ways, that localism is at the root of the housing affordability crisis here in New Hampshire and perhaps elsewhere. And if I'm misrepresenting you, Matthew, I apologize. You can correct the record later. And then finally, that in the case of land use, at least, our communities would be better off if decisions were made not at the local level, but at the more centralized state level. So at least those, I think, are three principal claims that you made. So I'd like to start maybe with you, Representative Al Howland. What do you think?
So, I mean, I've heard over the last couple of years a lot of pushback on municipalities, saying that we're not doing a good job, that we're the root of the housing crisis, and that local development just works too slow and it's too painful. And that is true in many cases, I can say from personal experience. But I think the reaction that we've gotten to that, particularly in the last year, is just this like wave. We went 180 degrees the other way and are saying, let's just zone the whole state and take it away. And I think that's a mistake. So I think the argument, oops, is that working? Still? Yeah. It's kind of, so I don't believe it's an either or. I believe that the right approach is actually a collaboration between the state and the municipality. And I think, we had evidence over the last several years in which we invested money in planning. We help municipalities. We can see the ordinances they've passed, and we can see the work they've done. So I think there's data to support that local control, enhanced, I would say, with the help of the state, I think is the best path for choosing how municipalities do their housing. So that's my try. That's
Thoughtful. Maybe we will have some more time to talk about it, but could you give us one example of that kind of collaboration between the state and the local community that might evidence what you're talking about?
So I think there was the housing opportunity grants that came from the state. And so the housing opportunity grants, it was 3 phases. The first phase, it was like you did a housing needs assessment. The second phase is that you did a zoning ordinance overview or review. And the third, you actually pass stuff. And so we can look out at there's nearly 100 communities that did it. We can look at what they did and what they've built. And so I think we need to turn the focus away from like all localism is bad to how does localism actually work? Where is it successful? And I think that's a conversation that we really need.
Great. And Matthew, we're going to give you a chance to respond in a minute. So if you do. Maggie, your work in Dover was successful. So just want to ask what your reaction is to Matthew's comments. Do you think that his concerns about what happens at the local level when it comes to housing, did you see that in Dover, or do you have a different perception?
Well, we certainly saw it in Dover. As anybody knows, going to a planning board meeting in the state, that you are going to hear all sorts of opinions. As a person, especially on the heels of what we're going through in the country right now, I don't believe that we should be silencing anybody and not hearing anybody's opinion regardless of what that is. However, I think that one thing that worked very well in Dover was that the planning board and the head of the planning board at that time had a very clear vision for the community that was based in a long-standing master plan vision for the community. A lot of experience, in supporting different housing types, and so I feel like there was something really robust there. And he was a champion of our project, and so he understood that at a bigger level, that he was able to say, hey, Mrs. Jones, I realize that you don't like this project. I hear you. However, I have 30,000 other people, he didn't say this, but 30,000 other people in this community that haven't shown up here tonight because they've got kids, they've got all the things that make it difficult, that clearly don't have enough of a problem with this project to stop it. So I think that there's a little bit of both. And to kind of comment, I think that on the combination, live free or die is a strong thing. It's not just a thing on our license plates. We have a lot of libertarian attitudes in New Hampshire, and I don't think that we're going to change that. But at the same time, what if we used, the regional planning commissions more and having a representative on boards and, a greater access? What if the planning boards had an, opportunity to go and meet with the planning commissions as well? And so getting a lot of feedback, maybe there's opportunities to bridge that.
Wonderful. And I have a question that Drew, you can answer if you want, or maybe Matthew later. But that strong impulse for freedom here in New Hampshire, does that equate to localism? Are we more free by having local autonomy? And so we can come back to that. So, but Drew, if you want to answer that, you can respond to it, but general reaction.
Well, it's actually part of my answer. And I'd like to say, as somebody who's, I think, would be categorized on the right of center versus Matthew, I agree with Matthew on the idea that so the Josiah Bartlett Center has done studies. We've done our own analysis of the situation in New Hampshire. We looked at studies all across the country. It's absolutely unequivocally true that local government regulations are the primary, not the only, the primary cause of our housing shortage in New Hampshire and all around the country. Where there are housing shortages, the number one cause is local land use regulations. Conceptually, and we have to roll those back, conceptually where I disagree is I don't conceive of this as a state versus local issue. That's not the dynamic to me. This is government versus individuals and communities. And I want to drop those terms there and have you think about this for a second. Your local government is not your community. Your community are the individuals who live in your town. You, as a property owner or as a renter, you're renting from somebody who owns property. You, as an individual, have property rights. If you think back, so I want to go through a timeline here real quick. New Hampshire state government has all of the power in New Hampshire. Under our state constitution, we're not a local control state. Whatever powers the local government has were granted to the local governments by the state. All power resides in Concord. Now, I want you guys, those of you who are from New Hampshire can picture a New Hampshire town. Those of you who are not, I'm going to say a phrase and just have you think in your minds. A picture, the first thing that comes in your mind. A New England town. What do you picture? Maybe you'll picture Amherst. Maybe you'll picture Portsmouth. Maybe you'll picture Salem or Gloucester. Maybe
Gilmore
it's a Currier. Maybe what's that?
Gilmore Girls.
Yeah. Maybe it's a Currier and Ives painting, right? We have lots of New England towns in New Hampshire that grew up organically as communities. They were built as communities. What you picture as a New England town is something that New Englanders built with their own hands through property rights. Picture that town. It most likely has a home. Maybe it's a white painted home with black shutters. Most likely, it's also going to have a library and a church and a school and a general store. Picture Amherst, New Hampshire. Everybody loves the town green in Amherst. Walk the town green in Amherst sometime. There are 2 gas stations on or just off the town green in Amherst. There is a duplex right across the street from a general store. This grew organically until 1925. 1925 was when the state granted local governments the power to tell people what they can and can't do with their property through zoning regulations. That was the start of all of this. So to me, conceptually, it's not the state versus the local government. It is government versus individuals who would freely like to build communities on their own that provide housing opportunities and commercial opportunities to people as they see fit, organically and naturally growing. The local town government says, no, we're going to prevent you from doing what you want. What's the purpose of making something illegal? What's the point? The point is that somebody would otherwise do it if the government didn't prohibit it. So these local zoning regulations are preventing you as individuals and you as voluntary communities from doing what you would like to do, which is provide housing to your kids.
Thank you, Drew. Matthew, response to that. So Drew is suggesting that we should change the terms of the tension here. It's not local versus centralized or community versus state, but rather individual versus government. What's your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, again, as I started, what I love about the housing issue is that it brings different kinds of people together in different kinds of ways. I think that is a great pitch to a right of center audience about what's going on here, because it's vexing to me that in New York State, for example, where there was a proposal in the legislature to strengthen property rights, in effect, selectively, it was being unanimously opposed by Republicans who conceptualized it as, oh no, like the evil powers that be in Albany are like changing my community, right? When it would be better, I think in that case, to see it as the government in Albany was trying to strengthen the property rights of landowners in New York State. Traditionally, there is an association between libertarian politics and localism, because in most regulatory arenas, if you assign regulatory powers to a lower level body for reasons of essentially competitiveness, that institutional setup encourages a lighter touch on regulations, right? Because you're trying to attract businesses to your state. Whereas, and so you'll have people on the left saying, no, like we need the federal government to do environmental regulation because otherwise there's going to be a race to the bottom. Or you might have people in a more pro-business perspective saying, no, we need to leave this up to the states so we can have pro-growth decision making. What's interesting about land use is that it does invert that, right? I mean, what I'm trying to say in this talk is that when you have the conversation at a hyper-local level, you tend to lead to a more a more intensive regulation instead of a race to the bottom. You wouldn't even like that phrase, but it's different, right? The political economy of the situation is that when you localize the decision making, the tighter regulation starts looking better to people. Whereas when you have it done at a higher level, I think the argument for stronger property rights and more growth sort of comes to the fore. I mean, I remember having this argument, though, probably 15 years ago, Cato Institute in DC had like a panel where a bunch of us were talking about like what should our viewpoint be? Like, do we want deregulation through the central government, or do we want localism? Robert Nozick was one of my professors in college, and he had this argument, right, where you have more exit from local government than you do from big units, so it's more acceptable to have tight regulation there. So, you can kind of argue the metaphysics and the philosophy of this in different kinds of ways. But I mean, I think we're aligned that fundamentally, if you want there to be enough housing for people to find places to live, you are better off with a lighter touch regulation, and that means withdrawing local government's authority to tell you what you can and can't build.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I just want to really quick follow up on that. But conceptually, I think the difference might be, we want the same thing. So state government withdrawing the power of local governments to overregulate this stuff. But to me, that is the state government restoring the pre-1925 property rights and individual rights that we had as citizens, rather than, I think a lot of people we're hearing who oppose this are saying, well, you're giving power to the state. No, I don't look at it that way. We're just taking power away from government and returning it to the people.
Wonderful. I want to go back to this idea of what's happening at the local community and governance. Is it anti-democratic? Representative Howland, you do a lot of work in your local community in Durham, but also at the state level. Do you experience the potential for what Matthew is talking about of unrepresentative governance at the local level? Or do you think that we should generally trust our communities and what's happening in terms of democracy and healthy representation? Because I think that's at the root of what we're talking about at that level.
Well, he can't go negative on his
He
constituents.
can't. And I apologize if I'm putting you on the spot.
So I have, actually, this summer. You know, I've been active with the group that introduces local zoning ordinances. And I always get a kick, by the way, when everyone talks negatively about government. I'm like, oh yeah, that's me. Yeah. But, so yeah, I mean, I've sat in a room where it was a 3.5-hour meeting. We went through 2 public hearings. The average age, I'm old, but they were older than me. They were highly organized. You only get 5 minutes for your public comment. They had seceded their time to a 20-minute block to do a PowerPoint presentation against us. So I have seen it. I think you have to also keep in mind, though, that New Hampshire municipal government is not monolithic. In SB 2 towns, literally the land use regulation is going on a warrant in the March election. So that you can't get much more democratic than that because people are voting on it. But yes, indeed, one of the difficulties with localism is that you can have a highly organized group of residents who prevent you or make it really, really challenging to do it. So that is the downside of localism. But I think in terms of over-regulating, I think that's what your master plan is supposed to be. You're supposed to identify in your master plan, we're trying to build these things, or these are the things we're trying to do. And then your zoning is supposed to follow through that. And why it's broken right now is, and it's detached regionally, there's no review process of the master plan. And so weirdly enough, at this fight that I've been in, people keep citing the master plan, and they're using an old master plan as a mechanism to reinforce the status quo, even though they're going against what's really in the master plan. So there's no way to really review, what did you do in the first 5 years of your master plan? Did you get anything done? And so, and regionally, the last regional planning did put in housing targets, but we don't have any housing targets to really assume, to judge how we're doing. So I think, localism can work, but there needs to be some fixes. I think that's a little
wonderful. I just have a quick follow-up question to that. So as Matthew enumerated, there's a number of bills that have passed the legislature this year that were signed by the governor that were zoning related, that somewhat restrict what communities can do in terms of zoning. And I'm sure you've been at the core of this debate at the State House. So I'm just wondering, do you think there are some occasions at least where some state preemption is required in order to maybe restrict some of those tendencies at the local community that you have seen?
Yeah, I mean, I have to be honest, I wasn't kidding, because we're going to go into like the next legislative session. I said, I really don't want to do any more zoning after what I just went through. But I think in terms of like the ADUs, I think is a really good example. It's the lowest hanging fruit. It really makes a lot of sense. The state had stepped in with ADU regulation, but it needed to be updated. So I think there's a balance here. I think the other thing that really, I would say from the state perspective that we know is successful is funding planning. You're not going to get around the housing crisis without planning. And I think funding and helping municipalities develop really good regulations is good. I think that is where the state really can be helpful.
And on a positive note at the community level, Maggie, it sometimes can work. I mean, you've seen it work, you've made it work. What are the keys to making the building of more housing in our communities work? What do you think made a difference in Dover?
I think the biggest key for us, getting the approval for our project was individual listening. And I know that sounds really time consuming. And, it's funny because I was thinking about, the planning board meetings that we've been to as well. And it's when you're trying to build affordable housing and you have no margin in the budget, it's hard to say, hey, I'm paying my engineer here $275 an hour for him to sit here and listen to Mrs. Jones tell her opinion, even though it's important. It's hard to balance that. But what was successful for us in Dover is that John and I, we went driveway by driveway and we listened to our neighbors and we talked to them and said, we heard them, and who's going to live here and what's this going to look like and how big are these houses going to be, and but we also had the zoning to back it up. So we weren't trying to create something new and ask for 1,000 variances. So, I think about that community group that had the power to say no, and they killed the project, or made it smaller for you. They didn't have that power. Their voices could be heard, of course, but the zoning supported what we were trying to do. So that was an interesting dynamic. But once we explained, to the neighbors, we did renderings for them. We worked with them and said, hey, this is what this is going to look like, and here's what's going to be, and who's going to live here. None of those folks in the neighboring HOA showed up at the planning board. So, and I take that as a positive thing. Like I said, if you're not going to complain, that's good, right? So I think that there was a lot of positivity to be had, but it is time consuming.
Great. So last question for everybody, and we'll start with Drew, and we'll go across. Just sort of looking forward, because we want to solve this housing crisis that we have. What's one thing you would look to see happen in the next year? Maybe something kind of feasible
Sure.
that you would like.
Well, so I think we actually got started on that. So one of the bills that passed this year was HB 399, which creates a commission to study the power that the state granted to local governments to zone, right? So this year is the 100th anniversary of our zoning law. And so this was, I think, the most important bill that passed this year. The commission has been created. So what they're going to do is look at to what extent local governments have exceeded their statutory authority, right? So if you're an executive branch agency, you have the authority to write rules, but you can't go beyond what the legislature authorizes you to do. The legislature actually reviews those rules. We haven't had a process, really, a process that works. The Housing Appeals Board is one of those that works. But this will review those zoning rules. So they are only allowed by statute to address health, safety, and general welfare. Well, they've taken the general welfare provision and run with it, right? So some of these regulations, whether you ban ADUs or a 3 or 4 acre lot size, you can't justify that on public health, public safety, or general welfare, right? So that review, I think, is going to be super important when we come back with recommendations to say, you know what, maybe here are some overall powers. And this does not abolish zoning. The point is not to get rid of zoning. The point is to say, maybe we should make sure it is consistent with the legislative intent, that it can only be used to address these core issues. I think that's going to be the most important thing in the next couple of years.
Great. Thank you, Drew.
Yep.
Nagy, how about you? And it could be at the local level.
I think that Siri should always be allowed. Something that I think that I would, like to see happen. I am excited about the idea, again, more of a housing appeals board. I think that it's an interesting process going up for, in a planning board meeting and knowing that, it's interesting you talk about community versus government, and such, but when we're used to doing something one way, and when presented with something different, even if it's perhaps a better way of doing things, it's still the thing I don't know. And so the fear is there. Fear is that, who's going to live here? What is my community going to be like? And when you're facing a planning board of your community members, you're going to run into your folks down at the store and such. It can be a hard thing on both sides. So I do think that having some, more education, from Concord or from the planning commissions coming in, and, checks and balances, I think that would be a really great thing. I am really interested in seeing incentive programs. I listened a lot to Freakonomics. John and I were building these tiny homes and we're flooring, as Max knows. And we're listening to, the podcast and talking a lot about incentives. And, you can't tell your child that you're going to get all A's this semester. But you can say, hey, if you get all A's, this will happen. And so, I wonder how we incentivize local governments, or local boards and such to help that. I think that would be a really interesting thing. And I know that some, Invest New Hampshire has done a lot of work in this way and things, but, let's talk about what can we do to incentivize water and sewer upgrades, zoning upgrades, all of these things. I think that would be helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maggie. Representative Howland.
So, I mean, I already alluded to it. I think linking the municipal master planning to the regional 5-year master plan review is really important. I think limiting master plans to no more than 10 years and having it linked to your town's capital improvement plan so that you're actually investing in infrastructure and that to get the housing you want. I think having the municipality at the 5-year mark, what did you get done? And we did this exercise, and our planning board chairs back there, we did like a chicken and goat ordinance and a really bad solar ordinance. And so you aren't getting it done. And I think in terms of incentives, I think right now there's a lot of, zoning alone will not solve the housing crisis. I have bad news with that. It just won't. So it's only one piece in it. And I think the incentives are necessary right now. A lot of municipalities, they've changed their zoning and they can't, it's really painful when you change the zoning and you realize you actually can't build what you really wanted to build. And I think a lot of municipalities are right there. I think making those incentives contingent on the fact that you've actually passed at least one housing zoning law in the last 3 years, you get priority, because that shows the intent of your community. It shows that you can actually get something done. So I think that is the best batch, because it allows accountability to the municipality, but still empowers them because they know what the best locations are to develop.
Wonderful, thank you. And Matthew, we're going to end with you before we turn it to the audience for Q&A. What's one thing you think New Hampshire could and should do? And it can't be getting rid of, I think, what you called us, our rinky-dink town line.
No,
you
you definitely can't. I think the next frontier for state government looking at these things is actually to look at some of the non-zoning regulatory burdens on housing. That there is very little, the federal government does a lot of cost-benefit analysis of different kinds of regulations that are coming down. And people always argue about it, but you at least have to do the exercise. You have to say, I believe that this rule will accomplish X, and it will cost Y, and X is greater than Y, and I have some reasons for that, right? And even if you think they're making bad calls, at least it lets you have a public debate about what's happening. Building code stuff that is supposed to be related to safety is like a total black box where no analysis is being done as to like, why do we have these rules? What is the incremental benefit of additional safety? What is the cost of it? How many lives do we think we're saving and at what cost? And it's frankly like the legislators, everybody is flying blind because there's not even a requirement that you like try to say why you think these are good ideas or not. And some of these kind of non-zoning rules are incredibly costly and really need to be looked at.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. So now it's going to go to the audience, and we already have some hands. So let me just, Alyssa's coming with her box. Yes.
I did find the handheld Xavier.
Okay, so we have some handheld mics, and Xavier's going to be, is it just one mic going around, Alyssa?
Yes.
Do you guys have a
So
class?
first, before we turn it over and start asking questions to our panelists and our featured speaker today, will you join me in thanking them for
Yes.
We are looking forward to your questions. Is it Andy, right? Yeah.
All right, this is on? Great. Excellent. Great dialogue. Thank you all very much. Private equity, right? Hedge funds. My understanding is that the impact of Wall Street firms buying houses is relatively small compared to the dynamics that have been raised today, but nonetheless, the idea of a Wall Street anything buying a single-family house is a lightning rod on this issue. So I would love to hear your take on all that. Should we limit some institutions from being active in this marketplace? What do you think?
I can guess what Drew's answer is going to be.
It's a good guess.
But we'll start with Matthew.
Well, I think it's actually really interesting if you ask the people who've invested in sort of build-to-rent, single-family housing, why they think this is a good asset class. They will tell you it's because they believe there are incredible regulatory barriers to entry. Exactly. So I think that more than I think it's fine if politicians want to say, I think that this is a bad trend, that I think that this trend goes against the American dream of homeownership, like as a vibe, because that makes sense to me. But then you have to ask, like, why is it occurring, right? Like, why would somebody think that an asset class that forever big institutional investors have had no interest in, why are they suddenly interested in it? It's because they believe that regulatory-induced scarcity is going to stick around. And the challenge is to prove them wrong.
I completely agree with that. A couple of additional points. One is why, if you're asking why is this happening, well, the number one reason is you've got this government's created scarcity, it's increased the prices. If you've ever been to home auctions in New Hampshire, and I have, it used to be the case that guys would show up who were just small investors who buy one or two things. They're getting outbid because the scarcity is driving the prices to the point that these massive companies are the only ones who can win the auctions. So that's a massive problem. Two, we actually have some academic research done on this and find that it doesn't actually, it actually helps lower prices in the rental market. So you don't want to ban it. What you want to do is end the rent seeking that allows it to happen in the first place.
Okay.
Yes, Ivy.
I'm Ivy Van, and I have sat on every side of this table. I've been the chairman of my planning board. I'm a working town planner. I did a bunch of HOP grant work in the last 2 years. I'm also an evil developer. I own 4 units of rental property. So one of the things that I was thinking about when I was listening to the rep, and I served in the state legislature for 4 terms. Where I talked about nothing but housing, to very little avail. I'm glad to see that the conversation has come further more recently. So one of the things that I was thinking about when you were talking about what we can do for these local planning boards is to understand who serves on them and what can we do to get them to see that larger picture. And I've been in the trenches, and I think that's a really hard nut. One of the places that in New Hampshire, the towns and cities in New Hampshire that have actually made progress are the ones, by and large, where that new zoning rule does not have to go to town meeting vote. It can be adopted by the city council. That was true in Dover. It's true in Newmarket. I just wrote new code for Newmarket. It's true in Lebanon. So I think when we talk about, well, there can't be anything more democratic than town meeting, I think that looking at that more carefully is worth it. But my question is, and I really do have one, which is, what do you think about the idea of state statute which would move more projects from a public hearing to an administrative review? What's your take on that? I have one, but I'll let you talk.
Do you want this?
So I think I am in, where I live is a town council form of government, and just because it's not going to the people doesn't mean you're going to pass it. I can give you great certainty of that. Actually, you can watch video of me getting pummeled trying to do it. I think I'll start with the first thing in that was that I think you have to convince these poor souls in your community to join the planning board where they're going to go twice a month and do really technical things. And I think in the Housing Champions, one of the scoring criteria in there is like training these poor people so they know what's going on, and also giving them professional development so they know what other trends are that are going in the state. I think doing that empowers your planning board to make good decisions and to write good ordinances. And so I think not doing that is a critical mistake that we're making.
Well, I don't like to answer Ivy's questions because there aren't many people in New Hampshire who know more about housing than Ivy Van. So I always feel like she's the expert. But I think conceptually you're right that it is that, it's the democracy thing we were talking about earlier, right? The democracy part of this is actually violating my individual rights, right? And that goes back to my concept of this, which is it's democracy, the vote of the people, against individual property rights. We don't live in a democracy, and I will absolutely die on this hill. I know this IOP needs to raise this issue, but we live in a constitutional republic. And the reason we do is to prevent an excess of democracy, which is the majority violating the individual rights of the citizens, right? So that's where we are in the big picture discussion of this. So just to give you an example, so when we did our Josiah Bartlett Center study in 2021, Newmarket was our #1 town in New Hampshire as the least friendly to property rights. If we did that study today, it would probably be Wyndham. Wyndham has lost at the Housing Appeals Board 9 times. No, they've had 9 cases, they lost 6 of them, right? So they have an excess of democracy where they're actually responding to the the bill that allows you to build rental properties in, or multifamily properties in commercial zones. They're trying to zone commercial zones rural. So they're just going insane to try to control the town to violate everybody's property rights, right? So that's my conception of it. So if you can take a little bit of that, and again, I wouldn't abolish zoning, I wouldn't take necessarily everything out of this, but you do have to pull back some of that collective power and restore those rights back to the property owner.
I think Maggie might have had.
I thought Matthew might want to tell the minimum height story we were talking about earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so this is a situation developing in California, but just an example of the kind of state-town whack-a-mole, which was that, the state government had passed a law saying that, at least in certain areas, you had to allow multifamily apartment buildings. And so one town, which didn't want to do that, they came up with the idea of establishing a minimum height of the multifamily building. So it was going to have to be 25 stories or something that they knew would never pencil out. So, the Attorney General is suing them to say that doesn't really comply with the law. But, it's an example to me of the challenge of state-local collaboration in this field. Ideally, you do get collaboration. There are towns that have really good people on their planning boards who really want to do good things, and when state law changes, that then empowers them to really redesign things, and amazing things happen. You also, you have town governments where the government's authentic preference is to not allow anybody to build anything, and you can keep futzing around with it, but ultimately some kind of, I've heard it as ministerial, you said administrative approval process, I think ultimately is what you're going to have to get to, because I think we're not going to move to a libertopia where buildings are an unregulated space. So having an authoritative regulator who says yes, rather than 17 different ones who can all say no, I think is ultimately going to get you where we want to be.
We have a funny example like that in town. Again, I'll use Wyndham as our example. So we have a affordable housing law, which is a workforce housing law, which says, hey, every town has to allow reasonable workforce housing opportunities. So you know where I'm going with this.
Oh my gosh.
So that's actually a bad law, I think, because it's a terrible law, right? It was designed to allow, to encourage the development of lower income housing, lower, not like Section 8. But so towns have used this to say, oh, okay, we're going to require that 25% of the units in your building are workforce housing. Well, they know that projects become unworkable. You can't make the money work on that. Wyndham has taken it a step farther than anyone else in the state and said, fine, not only do we have a requirement that says you can't have any more than 12 units in an apartment building, but 50% of the units in your apartment building have to be workforce housing. Well, they know that that's not possible economically. No developer can do that. And so they've had developers come and say, look, guys, we want a variance to allow like 20%, 4 units, 2 units. And they have said, you guys don't support workforce housing. No, we're not going to allow that. They know darn well that they are just setting the bar too high so they can prevent housing at all. And that's what you get.
And this can go different ways. So, I mean, in Florida, they did the opposite. The Republicans wanted to do something that would let people build more housing. They couldn't quite get their whole caucus behind it, so they needed some Democrats. So they threw it in that, well, it was only going to be for workforce housing. But they wrote in a definition of workforce housing that was so lax that, like, most projects just qualify. Because, what does workforce housing mean? Right? Like, you write a technical meaning into the legislation, but these are just words. And they can mean whatever you want. And yeah, I mean, it's often, the thing is that there are so many different ways to get to know.
Yeah.
Right? If the outcome you want is nothing gets built here, there's the way that building is being blocked now, and you can say, well, we're not going to let you block construction through that mechanism, but you just come up with another one, right? And so we need to think ultimately in terms of outcomes, that we are trying to get to, which doesn't mean like, central, like we're not going to force you to build buildings on your land if you don't want to, but we want an outcome where landowners who believe that there is demand for more housing are able to build the housing that they believe there is demand for. And if we like hold that as a North Star, we can work through the political compromises and the procedural issues and try to get to that point. But otherwise, I think there's too many ways to fail.
And that's where we're going to have to wrap it up. I would like to take this opportunity to thank again Matthew Yglesias and our esteemed panel. I want to thank Dr. Max Latona for so capably facilitating our panel. I'd like to ask you to please save the date of Friday, December 12th. That's when we'll hold our annual Housing We Need Forum, right back in this room, and we look forward to seeing you then. And then I will say also there is a short reception happening in the West Wing. If you'd like to stay and talk with Matthew and the panelists a little bit more, we can see you just around the corner in the West Wing. Thank you guys so much for coming. We'll see you at the next one.